From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So we have a very, very, very distinguished panel of musical experts up here. And the purpose of this panel is to contextualize Irving in a larger picture of the American Neoclassical School. Whether or not you like that word, that's totally fine. Feel free to extend your opinions about the word while we're up here. And also to specifically look at the Boston group, who we've been mentioning a bit. Is there someone who would like to give an overview of who the 6 composers were in the Boston group?
Well, all right. The ones particularly that we're concerned with here were the 3 at Brandeis, Irving Fine, who was actually the 2nd faculty member there, and the Harold Shapiro, whom he hired, and then Arthur Berger, whom they also hired a couple of years later. Leonard Bernstein, although he was not technically a neoclassicist, also taught there for a while. And then there are some others actually not even mentioned, like Alexei Hayev, who was a friend of these, actually. Shapiro's widow called him Harold's buddy. And Fine, and he actually went to Austria together, I believe. They knew in Rome. They were from, Rome was the favorite city of Fine, Hayev, and Shapiro, and they met there.
We're going to do a rapid-fire round of introductions, but I want to give you the context of the composers first, because I think we can all agree that those composers are pretty significant and deserve our attention. So we'll go from the end. If you could all just state your name, where you're coming from, and how you're connected to Fine, please. Starting with Wayne down the end.
I'm Wayne Shirley. I worked for many years at the Library of Congress. I was not actually a student of Irving Fine's at Brandeis, but I was musicology, he was composition, but it was a thrill to see him, and I did one thing that was very helpful for him, and something that none of us has mentioned yet. The first electronic music studio in America was the Columbia Princeton studio. Everybody knows that. Who knows about this sort of thing? The second was in the Americas. The second was in Toronto. Yale and Brandeis were in a race for the third. Yale came out strong at the beginning with a big symposium and everything, and everybody talks by a lot of people, some demonstrations from people who had been doing work either at Columbia, Princeton, or in their cellars, and said, isn't it interesting that the new Yale Electronic Music Studio is going to be in the place that used to have the old instruments? And I thought that was sort of sweet. Brandeis had sent me and one other person down to see what Yale was doing, and we had the very beginnings of a studio, and we had done a little bit of work, and we made some sounds. And I went up to the room that had once held the Yale University collection of ancient musical instruments, and I opened the door, and it was completely empty. So I think Brandeis came in third.
Well, there you have it. You heard it here first.
A little bit more to the point, I was the first person who did a piece. All of the composers were already doing their pieces. They didn't want to drop everything, learn a very messy kind of work, and boy, in those early years, there was nothing like a synthesizer. You just cut little pieces and glued them together, and they didn't always work, and then you had to do it again. And he called me up and said, would you be interested? And Irving Fine called me up and said, can you do a piece? Help me, the composer won't do it. And I swallowed a lot. And I said, finally said, yeah, yes, I will. And I heard him turn from the phone and say, he's gonna do it! And so I feel I have, so that is my greatest relation with Irving Fine, except for singing. I'm a second tenor, and I have sung so much of his choral music, and I love it so much.
Great.
I'm sorry that I just had to get the electronic.
Oh yeah, no, I knew you were going to do that too. Yehudi.
Yeah, I'm Yehudi Wyner. I am in many ways an outsider with a peculiarly distant relationship with Irving, because I was not part of the Brandeis situation in the beginning, and my one encounter with him that I can remember was when I was visiting. I spent 1 year at Harvard, and I went over to Brandeis, and someone said, or maybe it was Irving, said, come over to the house in Lincoln. And I really remember very little of it. I know we didn't discuss music, and I was not treated to anything special, but that was it. And my relationship with Irving then disappeared, for whatever that was, and only was rejoined years later when I joined the faculty at Yale, at Brandeis.
Ouch.
And, well, I mean, I wasn't boasting. And began to have contact with the Irving Fine concerts, and then increasingly with his music. That's all I'll say for the present.
I'm Susan Davenny Wyner, and yes, we can hold hands. Well, husband and wife. My contact with Irving was, first of all, through studies as an instrumentalist, but then I became a lyric soprano and had the joy of doing the childhood fables for grown-ups, which I recorded with Yehudi for CRI, and then went on to become a conductor. And again, had the excitement of bringing to life, first of all, those wonderful choruses, and then some instrumental works as well. And the excitement for me of hearing from the Fines, the kind of thing I sensed from his music, which is the warmth, the life, the humor, the richness of inner world and inflective harmonic languages, is very exciting to have put together with what I sensed from his music, because often we as performers want to get a chance to know the person whose music we're performing. We get the inside world. And I have had some things perhaps I can say later about things we as performers need to keep in mind about his incredible culture as an artist. But that's it for now.
Maestro.
Well, I'd be ashamed to tell you how recently I became acquainted with Irving Fine's music at all. I like best orchestral music and also piano music, and I've been attending live concerts just about all my life, certainly since age 14 and 15 when I went to Carnegie Hall by myself and sat in the back row, and I can still remember the program. It included works by Debussy and Ravel and Brahms and Rossini, and but the reason the facts that I had not been aware of Irving Fine most of my life has a great deal to do with the fact that I wrote a book trying to fill in gaps in both musical history and musical performance. of this period and of American composers. And I wrote in the introduction of my book, which is out in the lobby there, Neoclassical Music in America, Voices of Clarity and Restraint, which, as a matter of the reason I'm here is that Nick Brown here wrote to my publisher last spring when the book was first announced and said, we want to talk to one of your writers. And so he asked me to participate in this panel today. And so I'd really minded that so much of this music was never heard live. I mean, there are some recordings, but even to do my book, I had to go into libraries and find old vinyl records, which libraries don't even want anymore, and I'm sorry to say. And some works I just had to find out by looking at scores, but I mean, I'm not an expert score reader particularly. And so, anyway, but I really mind missing hearing this music. And so, I could say more, but...
Well, we'll jump out from there. Jim is happy to sign copies of the book, too. I'll give the plug for him. They're available for sale at a discounted price because the Library of Congress is selling them, so do check that out up front. The other thing about books on Irving is that the Library of Congress produced, in conjunction with Pendragon Press and Philip Ramey, the only biography of Irving Fine. There are copies still available online on Amazon, and you can see one of them up in the lobby display as well.
Let me just say that individual biographies are the one exception to what I said. There's been no survey, as far as I know, I've been the only survey in American Neoclassical music, but there was the biography of Fine, and there are a few other biographies. There's
a new one on Talma.
There are two books on Piston, for instance.
There's a new one on Talma that's just coming out now,
okay.
And she was a close friend of Fine's, and we have both their collections, so you can see the correspondence back and forth, which is fun.
I was able to work from a number of biographies.
Great. So, one of the things that I would love for us to talk about is the relationship between the composers in the Boston Six, because they were all really close friends, and then they were also really close colleagues, and inevitably there were points where there was going to be competition, when people either get jealous of success of other folks, but the sense that I get, at least about Irving, is that he kind of liked to take it from a comedic side in terms of the reaction to Lenny's career skyrocketing. And we found some letters the other day where he and Harold are joking about, oh, you know, well, Lenny's made it and we're just here at Brandeis, whatever, composing and teaching. But there was some really great humor in there too. So is there a sense of that comes through in any of their music, do you think?
He was not somebody who put anybody down. I mean, he looked for the best colleagues he could get. And that was one of the admirable things about him. But I could say how it was a group, and actually it was a movement as well as a group. And it was a movement because these people knew and respected one another. And the key to its being a group, actually, was the fact that it was Boston, the hub of the universe, as they said even when I lived there a few years ago. But it's, the institutional link was Harvard and Tanglewood and the McDowell colony. And then some of the people knew one another. For instance, Harold Shapiro was a close neighbor in Newton of
Natick, I think. In Natick, right?
No, in Newton.
Or in Newton, too.
When Leonard Bernstein and Harold Shapiro were very young, they became acquainted. They lived practically walking distance from one another, and they started playing ball together until Leonard was worried about his hand getting injured from a high rapid fall. But at any rate, and Bernstein had known Copeland in New York. He just went up to him at a party. Well, actually, what he did was he played Copeland's Variations, which really impressed Bernstein, and that's one reason why he came. Arthur Berger actually went to school with Bernstein at Boston Latin School, and then Irving, they all basically knew one another. They all went to Harvard pretty much, except Lucas Foss had not. Lucas Foss came from Europe. He got his musical training in Paris, but then got hired by Koussevitzky, where we had the Tanglewood connection. And so they knew one another there, and then because of a bit later in their careers, because of these very generous foundations, which established the McDowell Colony in Yaddo, they were in residence for extended time and did a lot of their compositions there. And at one point I quoted Fine in my book as being there at the same time as both Shapiros. and he said that Harold was writing his variations in C minor and playing a great deal of Beethoven. And people have heard, you can even hear a touch of the Hammer Clavier Sonata in those variations. So it's, there are some of the links between them that I miss anyway.
No, I think it would be great if we could continue on this question, but also throw in the notion of folks like Koussevitzky, Boulanger, and Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, actually, as people who were kind of the support system for this group, because without those three specific people, for example, Irving would have had less commissions, Bernstein wouldn't have become who he became, et cetera, et cetera. Any thoughts?
Well, Koussevitzky had a great deal of wealth from his wife, actually, and was very interested in new music, even in Paris, and when he came to Boston. And I'll tell a story about a Piston, actually. Piston was an earlier generation, but he was a Nadia Boulanger student in the 1920s. And he wrote, basically, it was a long time before he wrote any large-scale work. And so he was introduced to Koussevitzky, I think by Edward Burlingame Hill, professor at Harvard, who retired around the time these people graduated. Anyway, Koussevitzky talked to Piston, and he said, why do you not write orchestral music? And Piston said, well, nobody would play it. And Koussevitzky said, you write, I'll play. So Piston said, so I wrote and he played. And in fact, the Boston Symphony played just about all of Piston's works, and after Koussevitzky, his successor, whom we heard the other day and saw in the film the other day, also continued commissioning and playing this music. Now, Coolidge, I don't know that much about. Her name comes up frequently in connection, particularly with, say, quintets, which he seemed to have liked, and a number of them were commissioned played in this hall here.
So Mrs. Coolidge's role was, she had actually started a chamber music festival in the Berkshires that predated Tanglewood by about 20 years, I think, unless, Wayne, correct me if I get any of this wrong. But so she then became close to Koussevitzky, and she was out there always trying to figure out who were going to be the next generation of hot composers. So she propped up Benjamin Britten when he lived in the United States. She propped up Irving very much with the Romanza, even though he didn't get to hear it performed down here in Washington. But she was going all over the world kind of picking the cream of the crop before some of them had emerged onto the scene. And then same with the Koussevitzky Music Foundation, which now fully resides in the Library of Congress. Irving's partita was that right? Yes, partita. And Koussevitzky commissioned Harold's Symphony, for example, and Koussevitzky, of course, commissioned Bernstein and Copland, et cetera. So there's this role that the library has played in these various foundations existing out in the world and supporting these composers, and then now, as the repository for the manuscripts, we kind of are responsible for making these people come alive. And we're particularly interested in addressing the parts of the repertoire that all the other presenters aren't addressing all the time. So for example, the toccata transcription, for example, even though we need orchestras to play the orchestral version, why not add something else to the mix? And as a library, we're not going to go do the works of Bernstein that are done everywhere else all the time, because we want to make sure that his repertoire lives in its breadth.
Copland too.
Yeah, and Copland too, exactly, with the sextet that you heard today, for example, an exquisite piece that people just don't know about outside of the small people who have heard it, which is fascinating. So we've lightly touched upon this notion of music being popular or not, like classical music or neoclassical and that sort of thing. Is there a sense, and maybe you all can explain this because I know it did happen in a certain point, when did neoclassical music go out of fashion? Why? And then is or has there been a resurgence in popularity for that repertoire?
I can speak to that.
I think we're going to ask the other panelists for 1 sec. Yeah.
Yeah, I was there when it happened. I was an undergraduate from 1953 to 1957, and that was at that time, finally, when you were teaching techniques of 20th century music, you always ended up with 12-tone, and so you started writing 12-tone music yourself. And also, it was the time when the works of people like Anton Webern started really being published. You could get them. I remember a day in 1956 when I looked at the newly arrived music shelf, notes on paper music, and picked up the Webern second cantata and opened it to the second movement and thought, oh my God. And it was the music, the 12-tone guys, which had been ruthlessly kept down, of course, in Germany and Austria, where their publishers were, and barely had made a headway in this United States, because there's a lot of writing against them. I read it all in the 1940s explaining how it couldn't possibly be good. And I came in 1953 knowing a great deal of Stravinsky and almost no Schoenberg, and I never lost my faith in music that was tonal, but the discovery of this new thing and the fact that everybody suddenly started writing it because it was, you found out you could write it when you were taking this course, and it caught. That's a wild simplification, and it's just what I remember, but I have the feeling that in a way I was there when it happened.
Definitely. Yehudi?
Well, it's entirely possible that any style, any movement, wears itself out to some extent. And we have to remember that the patron saint of neoclassicism in our time was Stravinsky. Even though, as Martin, my wonderful old colleague, mentioned, the only three pieces of Stravinsky that were regarded as canonic and really worthwhile were the first three ballets, and after that, when he turned to neoclassicism or other means, his music was useless. And if you read Pierre Boulez, you would see that that is what his opinion was. But at a certain point, Stravinsky too began somehow to run out of, I think, the vitality possible in the neoclassic procedure. I mean, there are late pieces. The latest, of course, is the opera, which has gained a remarkable place in the repertory, and even late pieces like Orpheus, which is in some ways the most refined neoclassic piece ever written. But also, what you're saying about the emergence, the possibility of now beginning to hear the music of Webern and more of Berg and Schoenberg was also a factor, along with a barrage of publication and propaganda from the Europeans in their magazines, in the publicity. And that bears out, in a sense, what our wonderful ladies were saying about the Irving Fine legacy. It doesn't happen by itself, although as an artist, I wish that were the only thing that really mattered. In other words, you write the music, it's either good or it's not good, and it takes, and it remains forever. But very often, a lot of it depends for a period of gestation and consolidation, where the music is allowed to ferment, in a sense, and be performed and begin to make its impression. And I think that, in the long run, is what's going on with Irving's music, although you cannot deny its immediate appeal. I just want to say something about that. I don't want to talk long, but it seems to me that Emily first brought out and then was confirmed by something that Susan said. Irving, as a person and as an artist, exhibited so many dimensions of what we think of as a human being at its best. The warmth, the humor, the concern with communication, the concern with emotional projection, the refinement, the historical perspective, the excellence of technical accomplishment, and the idea that he was not just an individual solipsistic, selfish guy, concerned with education, concerned with even the welfare of his colleagues. Otherwise, why would he hire people as good as Harold Shapiro, as good as fine as Arthur Berger? And why would he deal with somebody who was so fabulously flamboyant and theatrical like Leonard Bernstein? And why would he tolerate somebody who was the most gifted of them all, like Lucas? And this man was more than just a composer. And I think that has so much to do with his establishment of the department at Brandeis, which is wonderful, but that's not what we really care about. We care about how all of that became a density of a human being and an artist.
Yeah, and I beg us to be careful how we use the label neoclassicism, because for someone who's come upon Fine later, that is too restrictive for his language and the places he takes us. And his tonal harmonic refinement is so deep, and I think what Marty said, the importance of the anchor of tonality is so rich. We heard last night, we heard today, the difference between how one tunes a tritone in Irving Fine is critical. If one does it too sharp, you don't feel the harmonic tension that will carry to the release later. If one uses a frequency vibrato, which is the wide flappy vibrato on the violin or the voice, versus a shimmer or a spin vibrato that doesn't add beats of sound to the music, you get a chance to feel the phrase go and the harmonies move. And I think at heart, Irving loved words and people. Even in his instrumental music, one senses an awareness of color and breath. And something I loved about the live performances we heard was that they breathed, they lived for us. And this label of neoclassicism, I think, gets misunderstood as something tends to be mechanistic. You wind it up, it goes, it's only about patterns that are contrapuntally maneuvered or that are retrospective to things, or that are only architectural and not warm, referring to future, the kinds of dimensions and places he was going in the symphony and those other pieces. So I just wanted to implore that we be careful, especially with this man's music, Sonny Shapiro too, not to box it off in that way. And I was excited to hear so many people talk about how much more Irving is as an artist and human being. Anyway.
Thank you, Susan. Yehudi, you've got to follow up.
Yeah. Along those lines, it's a cheap shot when people say, oh, about anything, oh, that music reminds me of Brahms. Oh, it's very much, it sounds like Gershwin, but oh, maybe it's like Monteverdi. And they think that by referring to something, they have identified its essence, and also they've shown off that they know something about the literature. I think there is something of that kind where people are constantly pointing out, oh, that comes from this piece of Stravinsky's and that comes from that piece of Stravinsky's. and in Irving's music, and there are constant references to other music, as if Irving was not Irving. And how come he was using all those references, so-called? But that's, as composers, that's what we are. We absorb music of all kinds. It becomes part of our subconscious reservoir. We often don't know the sources of where the music comes from. It's not done as a mechanistic operation. And it seems to me that there is a lot of precedent about it. If you think how much Beethoven is like Haydn, do we talk about, oh, that's like Haydn? Beethoven, with all his modeling for half his lifetime on Mozart's forms. How much does Verdi owe to Beethoven? Do you know? Half of Traviata is out of the Beethoven sonatas. And Mahler? Mahler's not Mahler without Schubert, right? And we don't think of those things. We just have to emphasize, just as Susan was saying, it hasn't got to do with these references or these labels. We really have to hear what the vitality and the warmth and the individuality of the music is, and realize that the references come as part of a historical chain.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think what you were just saying plays into the fact that for me personally, I think anyone can spend time with Irving's music, and once you've spent enough time with Irving's music, of all the genres and all the periods, you realize that he has such a signature sound that goes throughout all of the music, that when you hear it, you could hear 2 bars and you know who it is. And that's not something that a lot of composers can do, and that's really a remarkable thing that he's done and left us with, which is great. And like this evening, you'll hear 3 very different choral works, a short Alleluia, which is just a minuscule little piece, very beautiful, and it has its purpose. And then we have Alice in Wonderland, the first series, which are glorious, fun, jovial, but still very, intricate in the harmonic sense of things, and in terms of also the text painting is brilliant too. And then the Hourglass is just a whole other stratosphere, but in each one you know who it is once you've lived his music a little bit. We have time for one more closing thought from everyone, perhaps about what you hope to see from the future in terms of Irving's Fine, how it spreads, how we can play a part in bringing more people to it.
May I answer your last question first?
Sure.
It's an immensely important question, and it's a major theme in my book, and there are basically 2 different reasons why this music became eclipsed. And some of it came from the composers themselves, and some of it came from external pressure. And the external pressure started actually in 1944 in Paris, when Stravinsky premiered his Norwegian Moods. And Pierre Boulez, who was a young conservatory student, and some of his cohorts booed and hissed this piece. And this was, Pierre Boulez, after he became music director of the New York Philharmonic, bragged about this at on the Kavitz show in late night television. And it was only a few years before that, after that, that Stravinsky wrote his last neoclassical work, his opera, Grieg's Progress. Something very similar happened to Harold Shapiro in 1947, when he was booed and hissed, and someone, I won't name, I name him in my book, but I won't say it now, yelled from the balcony, "Hurrah for Beethoven." And he was booed and hissed off the stage, and he said, well, if people don't like my music, I won't write it anymore. And he wrote very little, I'm sorry to say, the whole time he was at Brandeis. He did have a revival later. But some of the composers actually since you have to remember this was in fact a group and a movement. Some of them simply became bored with tonality. And even Shapiro, who started out as writing serial music, and then was persuaded to turn to tonal music by Arthur Berger, who also started that way and then ended up as a serialist. And even Shapiro tried to write some serial music in his partita for piano and orchestra. As for Voss, he wrote neoclassical music until he went to California, and then was in charge of doing programs for new music, and he became avant-garde, and he never returned, although his last neoclassical work was actually his oboe concerto, I think even in the 1960s. but I talk about that too. And so it's, one more thing. Anthony Tomasita, the music director, chief music critic of the New York Times, wrote an article several years ago accounting his own personal experience at Yale when he was a grad student in music. And someone had the temerity to praise the music of Benjamin Britten, which we're going to hear tonight. And he was really sneered at for that. And so it may have been Tomasini himself who said that, I don't know. But at any rate, certainly was, Boulez was hostile. Boulez also persuaded people like Stravinsky and Copland to write, to switch. I mean, it became in the era, the new fashion was in fact serialism. Everybody had to do what the conservatories all made their students write serial music. So there were a lot of factors. And then the critics and there are other factors went in, but it was a major thing, and it's not totally explained, but I do write about it if you want to hear more, read my book.
Great. Closing thought, Susan? Closing thought?
I just wanted to thank you for doing the combination of live performing with talking about it, with presenting manuscripts and historical connections, so that there's a lure, perhaps, for musicians to explore an important figure in the so-called neoclassic movement and all of that, but that the live music gets a chance to speak.
Definitely. Well, I appreciate your thanks, but I really have to share that with all my colleagues and the vision that Mrs. Coolidge set for the library back in 1925. And this year we celebrate her 150th birthday, which is in the same year as Irving's 100th, which is really exciting. But really, without her, this model wouldn't be here. And thank God for her being a brilliant businesswoman, because the endowment is such that we're able to do the live music, and it's protected so that we do that. And the chief of the music division is charged with ensuring that her legacy continues on. And then now we have this legacy of all these other folks who have followed her model, like Mrs. Whittall, who gave us the Stradivari instruments, or Verna Fine, who gave us the Fine endowment, and many others. So thank you for recognizing this work. It's meaningful to hear that. And for those of you who are new to us today, this is the Library of Congress every day. And it's a unique thing where you can come to a place and you can see the manuscript, you can see the documents about how the work was created, you can see the sketches, you can see the photographs from the moment when it was premiered. And we really are about bringing these seemingly mute items, just a piece of paper, into life. And this is generations of life for Irving's music in one place tonight, which is really exciting.
It's a library in its best sense then. And I think the model that we've seen for the promulgation and preservation of Irving's music and his reputation has been made very clear to us by the way the Fine Foundation has worked in cahoots with the library. Thank you.
I have worked in the library, and I am tremendously proud of what it does. But remember, if your kids don't get taught how to play music, this will all die. Please.
I'm sure Irving would agree with that. So he's smiling from up in heaven. Right. Great. Well, before we conclude, I would like to thank all of our panelists, and also a huge thank you to the Brandeis Alumni Association for supporting today's program. And does that mean I have you out on time, that beeping? It does. How about that? Exactly 5 o'clock. So for those that are coming to the concert this evening, please remember to be back at security by 6:40 if you're exiting the building. There's going to be delays with security after that point. The show starts at 7 o'clock. There will be an intermission. And thank you all for spending your afternoon with us.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.